The 1904 to 1905 Russo-Japanese War stands as one of the most consequential yet often overlooked conflicts of the early 20th century. Fought between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan over strategic interests in Manchuria and Korea, the war shattered long-standing assumptions about racial and imperial hierarchies, particularly the presumed military and technological superiority of European powers over their Asian counterparts. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation not only challenged a major Western empire on the battlefield, but emerged decisively victorious. The global implications of this war extended far beyond the immediate theatre of conflict, reshaping international diplomacy, igniting revolutionary unrest within Russia, and emboldening anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa. The causes of the war were deeply rooted in imperial rivalry, nationalism, and the competing visions of modernity embraced by both Russia and Japan. While Russia sought to expand its influence in East Asia as part of a broader imperial mission, Japan's ambitions were fueled by a desire to assert itself as a legitimate great power and avoid the dire fate of colonized nations. The war was marked by brutal sieges, massive land battles, and one of the most decisive naval engagements in modern history, the Battle of Tsushima, where the Japanese Navy obliterated the Russian Baltic Fleet after its months-long journey around the globe. Marking a turning point in global power politics, it exposed the fragility and inefficiencies of the Russian Empire, while solidifying Japan's status as a modern military power, in doing so challenging Eurocentric assumptions and laying the groundwork for future geopolitical realignments in the 20th century. Welcome to Wars of the World. The roots of the Russo-Japanese War lie in the complex web of imperial ambition, regional rivalry, and domestic instability that characterized East Asia at the turn of the 20th century. Both Russia and Japan were expanding empires, with conflicting interests in both Korea and Manchuria, regions that had become strategically and economically vital to their respective visions of national power. The war was not the result of a sudden spark, but the culmination of years of rising tension, misjudgment, and mutual distrust. Japan's rise as a regional power began in earnest after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, when the country embarked on a rapid and state-directed modernization program. Recognizing the vulnerability of Asian nations to Western imperialism, most notably illustrated by China's defeats in the Opium Wars, Japan sought to emulate Western military, industrial, and administrative models. By the 1890s, Japan had not only modernized both its army and navy, but had also adopted an imperialistic posture like that of the European powers that it had once feared. Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95 marks its debut as a regional military power. The war concluded with the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which granted Japan control over Taiwan and the Liaoyang Peninsula, and recognized Korean independence, effectively placing it within Japan's sphere of influence. However, Japan's gains were short-lived. The Triple Intervention of 1895, spearheaded by Russia with support from France and Germany, forced Japan to return the Liaoyang Peninsula to China. Russia's subsequent lease of Port Arthur and construction of the South Manchurian Railway made clear its own designs on Manchuria, creating a lasting resentment in Tokyo. While Japan was a rising power, Russia was already an established empire seeking warm water ports in the Pacific to support its naval ambitions and trade. Russia's interest in Manchuria and Korea was driven by both strategic and economic factors. The completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1903 along with its southern spur through Manchuria, significantly increased Russia's logistical capacity in the region. However, Russia's methods of expansion were often slow, bureaucratic, and marked by underestimation of local dynamics, including the capabilities of Japan. The Russian government, under Tsar Nicholas II, viewed Japan as a second-rate power and saw little threat in extending its influence across northern China. Russia's refusal to withdraw its troops from Manchuria following the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, and its growing presence in Korea, increasingly alarmed the Japanese leadership, which saw its regional dominance slipping away. Between 1902 and 1904, diplomatic negotiations between Russia and Japan had repeatedly failed. Japan had hoped for a recognition of its interests in Korea, in exchange for acknowledging Russian dominance in Manchuria, whilst Russia, however, stalled negotiations and continued to strengthen its military presence in the region. These moves were interpreted in Tokyo as signs of bad faith and imperial arrogance, and Japan, meanwhile, had secured a vital alliance with Britain in 1902. The Anglo-Japanese alliance stipulated that if either signatory were attacked by two or more powers, the other would come to its aid. This agreement not only gave Japan diplomatic confidence, but also deterred other European powers from directly intervening on Russia's behalf. By early 1904, Japan's patience had worn thin. On February 8, 1904, Japan launched a surprise night attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur, making the formal beginning of the war. The preemptive strike mirrored Japan's strategic thinking: to fight swiftly and decisively before Russia could bring its full power to bear, particularly given the vast distance between Russia's European heartland and its far eastern territories. Both empires were also driven by domestic concerns. In Russia, the autocratic regime faced increasing unrest, economic hardship, and calls for reform. A foreign war offered the Tsar a way to unite the populace and distract from internal discontent. On the other hand, Japan saw victory as essential, not only to securing resources and territory, but also legitimizing its rapid modernization and deterring Western colonization efforts. The war unfolded as a modern conflict defined by industrialized warfare, high casualties, and strategic miscalculations, particularly on the side of Russia. From the offset, Japan's careful preparation and tactical initiative contrasted sharply with Russia's overconfidence, logistical weaknesses, and political indecision. The war was fought on both land and sea, with major campaigns focusing around Manchuria and the Liaoyang Peninsula, and ultimately culminated in a dramatic naval climax at Tsushima. On the night of February 8, 1904, without a formal declaration of war, Japan launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet housed at Port Arthur, modern-day Lushun, inflicting significant damage. Though it was not a complete victory, this opening salvo reflected Japan's strategic emphasis on initiative and speed. The Russian fleet, confined and demoralized, never fully recovered its operational strength. Soon after, Japanese ground forces landed in Korea and quickly advanced northward to occupy Seoul and move towards the Yalu River, the border with Manchuria. The Battle of the Yalu River in May 1904 marked the first major land engagement. Japanese forces decisively defeated the Russians, demonstrating their superior training, coordination, and morale. A major turning point of the war was the siege of Port Arthur, lasting from August 1904 to January 1905. The Japanese, under General Nogi Marasuke, launched repeated assaults on the heavily fortified Russian stronghold. The siege was long and bloody, involving trench warfare and costly frontal attacks. Despite fierce Russian resistance, Japanese forces managed to capture key hills and gun emplacements which overlooked the harbour. Then, on January 2, 1905, the Russian commander, General Anatoly Stessel, surrendered Port Arthur, both controversially and possibly prematurely, handing Japan a major strategic victory. With Port Arthur in Japanese hands, the Russian fleet in the Pacific was effectively neutralized. In the meantime, Japanese and Russian forces clashed in a series of large-scale battles across Manchuria, and the Battle of Liaoyang between August to September 1904, was the first major land confrontation between the two armies. Despite superior numbers, the Russians under General Alexei Kuropatkin were defeated due to poor coordination and a tendency to retreat when under pressure. The Japanese victory, though costly, boosted their morale and placed further strain on Russian logistics. Another decisive land engagement came at the Battle of Mukden between February to March 1905, one of the largest battles in history at the time. Astonishingly, it involved over 500,000 troops. The Japanese, under General Oyama Iwao, encircled and outmaneuvered the Russians in a complex 3-week operation. Whilst not a total retreat, Russian forces were forced to move northward, abandoning key administrative and transport hubs. The scale of the defeat stunned the Russian leadership and further weakened any popular support for the war at home. The final blow to Russia came at sea. With its Pacific fleet crippled, Russia dispatched its Baltic fleet, valiantly renamed the 2nd Pacific Squadron, on an arduous 18,000-mile journey from the Baltic Sea to East Asia. The voyage, lasting over 6 months, was plagued by mechanical failures, poor morale, and diplomatic incidents, including mistakenly firing on British fishing boats in what came to be known as the Dogger Bank Incident. On May 27 to 28, 1905, near the Tsushima Strait, the Russian fleet was intercepted by the waiting Japanese Navy under Admiral Togo Haihachiro. The Battle of Tsushima was a complete disaster for Russia. Outmaneuvered and outgunned, nearly the entire Russian fleet was either captured or sunk. Only a handful of ships escaped, and the victory confirmed Japan's dominance of the sea and effectively ended any realistic hope of Russian success. Tsushima also had a powerful symbolic resonance. An Asian power had destroyed a major European fleet in open battle, an event without precedent in early 20th century history. The Russo-Japanese War is often cited as the first major conflict of the modern era. It featured trench warfare, machine guns, barbed wire, long-range artillery, wireless communication, and the coordination of rail transport for troop movements, developments which foretold the technological and strategic realities of the not-too-distant First World War. The battle also demonstrated the importance of morale, intelligence, and logistics on the modern planes of battle. Japanese forces maintained high levels of discipline and national unity, while Russian troops, many of whom were poorly trained conscripts, suffered from disorganization and low morale, corruption, outdated command structures, and internal dissent plaguing the Russian military effort further. The war had left deep and lasting consequences for both empires, as well as the international system as a whole. While Japan had achieved a strategic and symbolic victory, the war also revealed the vulnerability of the Russian Empire and helped precipitate revolutionary unrest at home. Globally, the conflict marked a watershed in the history of imperialism and race relations, signaling a dramatic shift in power dynamics between East and the predominantly prejudiced West. For the Russian Empire, the war was an unmitigated disaster. Militarily, it exposed profound weaknesses in planning, command, and infrastructure. The defeat undermined the authority of Tsar Nicholas II and discredited the idea that Russia was a modern, capable great power. The war effort had overextended Russia's logistical capabilities and revealed the vulnerability of an empire ruled by rigid bureaucracy and outdated institutions. Critically, the defeat accelerated internal unrest. The Russian population, already suffering from poor working conditions, food shortages, and political repression, reacted with outrage. In January 1905, as the war was still ongoing, a peaceful demonstration in St. Petersburg was met with lethal force in what became known as Bloody Sunday. This massacre ignited the 1905 revolution in a wave of strikes, peasant uprisings, and mutinies, including the famed mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. To quell the unrest, Tsar Nicholas was forced to make concessions, leading to the establishment of the Duma, Russia's first national assembly. Although its powers were limited and often ignored, The Duma marked a symbolic weakening of autocracy. The war, in effect, exposed and accelerated the disintegration of Tsarist authority, a trend that would culminate in the Russian Revolution of 1917. The war formally ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905, brokered by US President Theodore Roosevelt, who later received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. The treaty recognized Japan's interests in Korea and transferred Russia's leasehold in southern Manchuria. While it ended hostilities, the treaty left both sides somewhat dissatisfied. Russia was humiliated, but retained much of its Siberian territory, while Japan had gained prestige and influence, but not all the reparations or land that it had hoped for. The treaty also marked a significant moment in the internationalization of Asian diplomacy. It signaled the rise of the United States as a mediator in global affairs and reinforced Japan's inclusion in global power politics. In contrast, Japan emerged from the conflict as a recognized global power. Its military success had stunned the world and validated decades of modernization, starting with the Meiji Restoration. The victory gave Japan control over the Korean peninsula and of southern Manchuria, including the lease of Port Arthur and control of the South Manchurian Railway. While Japan had hoped for even greater territorial gains, its status as a regional hegemon was now established and outweighed any other potential benefits. The war also marked the beginning of Japan's more assertive and ultimately aggressive imperial expansion. In 1910, they formally annexed Korea, establishing a period of harsh colonial rule, and emboldened by their victory, Japan began to seek parity with Western powers, fueling their ambition to become the dominant force in East Asia. Domestically, the war reinforced national unity and boosted the prestige of the military, particularly the pride of the Navy. However, Japan's dissatisfaction with the limited rewards of the Treaty of Portsmouth, especially the lack of a Russian indemnity, bred a sense of grievance amongst the nationalists in Japan, an undercurrent that would resurface in the bold militarism of the 1930s. The Russo-Japanese War had a profound psychological and ideological impact across the colonialized world. The image of an Asian nation defeating a European empire challenged deeply entrenched racial hierarchies. In Asia and Africa, the war became a powerful symbol of anti-colonial potential, and Indian nationalists, Vietnamese revolutionaries, and African intellectuals cited Japan's success as evidence that Western dominance was not inevitable. Even in Europe, the defeat was met with shock. Racist assumptions about non-Western peoples being inherently inferior were challenged, and many European powers, not least of which Britain, began to treat Japan with greater caution and respect. The Anglo-Japanese alliance was renewed and expanded, and Japan was increasingly regarded as a legitimate player on the world stage, culminating in its participation in World War I on the side of the Allies. However, the victory also had a darker side. It contributed to a sense of Japanese exceptionalism and a belief in the necessity of imperial conquest. Over time, the memory of triumph against Russia will be distorted into a justification for militarism and expansionism, particularly in the 1930s, as Japan sought to build its own colonial empire across East and Southeast Asia. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many Western observers treated Japan's victory as an unexpected exception, rather than a sign of structural change in the spheres of global power. European analysts frequently attributed Russia's defeat to logistical incompetence or internal decay, rather than Japanese tactical and strategic superiority. The dominant Eurocentric worldview struggled to reconcile the defeat of a white Christian empire by an Asian power. There were some, especially within the British and American press, who praised Japan's efficiency and discipline, but this was often framed in exoticism or patronizing terms that viewed the war as some kind of once-in-a-lifetime tale. Military theorists and strategists, however, took Russia's defeat seriously. Figures like Alfred Thayer Mahan examined the naval lessons of Tsushima, while European generals studied the siege of Port Arthur for insights into modern artillery and trench warfare. Nevertheless, the the broader political implications were downplayed by empires, eager to maintain confidence in their global dominance. Soviet scholars focused on the suffering of workers and soldiers, portraying the war as a catalyst for proletarian awakening, rather than as a purely military or geopolitical event. Whilst in Japan, their victory over Russia was widely depicted in literature, art, and education as proof of Japan's rightful place among the world's great powers. More recent scholarship has cited the Russo-Japanese War within the broader frameworks of imperial decline. Historians such as John W. Steinberg, Rotem Kauner, and J. N. Westwood have emphasized how the war disrupted racial and geopolitical assumptions, and it is increasingly seen as a transitional war, modern in its technology and scale, yet still rooted in 19th century ideologies of empire. Western powers, especially Germany and Britain, should have learned from Russia's defeat that modern warfare would be neither short nor glorious. The Russo-Japanese War was far more than a regional conflict between two expanding empires. It was a transformative event that reshaped international order, exposed the fragility of long-standing power structures, and signaled the dawn of a new geopolitical era. Japan's victory over Russia marked the first time in modern history that a non-Western power had defeated a European empire in open warfare, shaking the foundations of imperial ideology and racial hierarchies that had underpinned global politics for centuries. For Russia, the war laid bare the inefficiency and corruption at the heart of the Tsarist regime, and the military failures in Manchuria and at sea not only eroded the empire's prestige, but also catalyzed internal unrest that erupted into the revolution of 1905. This moment of crisis began a trajectory of political instability that would ultimately culminate in the collapse of the Romanov dynasty just over a decade later, effectively changing the very course of 20th century history.